Want to welcome you to another episode of Mindset Growth Podcast. I'm Gary Bontrager, your host. I have Ray Gage, my co-host, with me today. I appreciate you being here, Ray.
I appreciate being here too. I have a lot of fun when we're able to get together.
We do.
This, even though I'm not as good looking as Heather.
I was
your regular co-host.
I know,
right?
But we're letting you get us. You drove into Iowa City here, and so we've got to give you a shot at this deal.
I know. Sorry, Heather. Wherever you are.
I'll tell you what.
Out there somewhere.
Whenever we get together, it seems like we hit a lot of different deep conversations that come out of conversations with clients that we work with. And one thing that has come up recently, and as I sit down and I go through some inventory of my life and my life's experiences, I look back at how, as a younger person, I would react to situations and how I transitioned over the last number of years. And so now, instead of reaction, I try to respond. And it causes me to create a whole different mindset around what's going to happen and what's coming at me and how I'm prepared to handle those things. And there's a couple different things that have really made a difference. So one, just knowing when I was young and losing my father at a young age was very traumatic for me as a 15-year-old boy. And then the culture I was in at the time, there was no therapy. There was really nobody there for me. So at 15, all of a sudden, I go from losing what I would say was my best friend at that point in time, my rock in my life, to just being kicked out and feeling like I had to take on the world. And it created a couple of scenarios that I felt a lot of pain and hurt. So my reaction became self-defense. So whenever somebody said something, I was in self-defense mode before they were finished. And a whole string of thought that I have come across that I realized was I was listening to respond, but I was not, so I wasn't listening to understand.
You weren't listening to understand.
So there's a big difference between that, because if you're going to listen to respond, it's usually to defend yourself, and it's a reaction. And as that happened, I felt very misunderstood because I became so quickly at the responses. Probably looking back now, a lot were taken out of context. But it would leave me with this panic as I'd go home or be alone, because I felt like I just damaged relationships deeper and deeper because of my responses became that much more painful. And I became so much more angry,
right, and
wound tight, that it was just very difficult to have good relationships. So that was my foundation. And I think a lot of people tend to do that. But I'm curious to know what you've learned in some of that situation as you're young, because I think it's a natural human tendency.
Oh, absolutely is, because all of us are great at manifesting, right?
Yes.
So you hear the word manifesting, like, but when we think of the word manifesting, people talk about it like, I want a new boat, or like a vacation home, or I want to manifest this new job or whatever, and they're talking about things that they're trying to pull that don't exist into their present, right? But what we don't understand about manifestation is that I'm living in this present moment, and in this present moment, I'm manifesting this present moment. But where we're manifesting it from is the past,
right?
So we are stuck in the past because our present moment is a manifestation of our past, which is why we react. So when something happens, the way that we're wired, we're looking for the thing that happened before that was like that.
Right.
And it creates a reaction, because if we feel like we have to do something in that moment, like I have to respond to this thing that someone said, it's not really a response, it's a reaction that comes out, right? So my response is a reaction based on what happened to me before that I'm categorized as similar, right? So I'm making this, I'm going in the file drawer, right? So picture you're
Right.
pulling out that file drawer and you're looking for that file of, oh, this situation was like that. What did I do there? And boom, there's my
Right.
reaction. But it all happens in an instant because
Right.
of that, the
'Cause
way
the
that
situations come at us so
coming at us
quickly.
so quickly. But we don't usually take the time. So, like, I mean, we all do it. I mean, even people who try not to do it are still doing it because because we're so tied to the past.
Right.
Right. So if we want to start moving the needle, we have to start thinking like, oh, like I didn't like the way that I reacted to that situation. So that's the first step, right? So how could I have reacted differently? So now when I'm thinking about how I could have reacted differently, I'm starting the process of creating a response the next time so that the reaction isn't something that because usually if you react, the other person is going to react to your reaction.
So you're really building a new file drawer.
You're building a new file drawer when you start to respond. So let me give you an example of a response versus a reaction. This is one that a lot of people can understand, right? So if you have a kitchen fire and you haven't prepared yourself for having a kitchen fire, you're going to react.
Right.
Well, what is most people's reaction to a fire? Throw water on it.
Right.
Well, if you throw water on a kitchen fire,
you likely have a bigger fire.
You're likely going to have a bigger fire.
Seems like you've been in insurance or something.
But I mean, that's just,
right.
You think about it, everybody knows that, right? You don't throw water on a kitchen fire. Well, you shouldn't. Maybe not everybody knows that because they haven't thought about it, but you shouldn't.
It'll make grease splatter and
right. That's going to make it worse, right? So a response is having thought about in advance, if we have a fire, we know we bought a fire extinguisher that's going to work in a kitchen.
Right.
So it's specially rated for the kitchen. We know where it is, we know how to operate it, and we've shown everybody in the house that's old enough to understand how to operate it so that in the event that happens, we are now responding.
Right.
And not reacting, because if we react, we're going to make it worse.
Right.
So that's, for a lot of people, that's a really good way to understand, well, what is a response versus a reaction? Well, that's what that would look like, right? So that's the one that I like to bring up that actually I think it came from a client that said when we were talking about respond versus react, and he says, I think I got a great analogy for you.
Here's one that I ran into with a client recently, because I feel like sometimes we learn more from our clients than we teach. But I had a client recently who responded. Actually, he reacted to a situation. And he was working through this whole process of learning to respond rather than react. But something happened and he flipped and he reacted. Mm. And as he's telling me about it, I said, that was a great response. And he said, no, I reacted. And I said, so what would have you done differently? Because what you did in that moment needed to be done. And he said, I was pissed off and I got angry. And I lost control of myself. And I said, but did it come off that way? And he said, oh, yeah. He said, they needed to hear my voice raise. They needed their butts chewed. But he goes, I lost control of myself. And I said, but would have that changed? And he goes, no, I'd have probably done the same thing. It was how I felt. It was all about how he felt because they had pushed him to a point and we'd been working through this process, and that was his, but he was aware of it because he's been working through the difference between reacting and responding. And I don't think he would have said anything differently, was his conclusion. It was how he felt about it because he knew he had lost what he felt was control of himself. So it was just interesting to me that the awareness was there. Like, no, I said the right things.
Right.
They needed to they needed to hear what they heard. They needed to come at him the way it came at him. His only disappointment was the internal feeling that he had.
Right.
Because here's the other aspect of this. By him losing control, he showed weakness and he let a weaker person control him. which can be a whole nother aspect to go down. But typically when we respond, we're in control of the situation. And one thing I found very helpful for me till I really built out that new file drawer, and I will still use this to this day, I'll listen to them go through that process of whatever they're saying. And rather than me reacting, I will say, can I think about this for a minute? Can I get back to you tomorrow? But I try to buy time because it will escalate. If you just continue to react, it's what you said earlier. The reactions are now flying back and forth. And pretty soon people are not breathing. They're just red in the face and they're screaming and being really stupid.
Right. And there's so much more damage that's created
Yes.
when that happens. And it's hard to come back from that. So, and that can be in any relationship, but we all do it almost all the time because unless we sit down and try to be intentional about doing it differently and responding instead of reacting, we're just going to react. Separately, I'm Gage.
And I'm Bontrager.
Together, we are Gage Bontrager Consulting.
We work on changing your mindset,
Developing leaders,
building systems and processes
helping you grow personally and professionally
to achieve the success that you want personally and professionally.
however you choose to define success for you.
Reach out to us and follow us on social media or look us up on the website, and that will put you on a path to achieve what is missing in your life.
Thanks for watching this episode of Mindset Growth Podcast.
But I want the audience to think about this. When you lose control and you're just reacting, you're allowing other people to control you. And at that point, you're losing control of yourself. And it doesn't mean that you're flying off into a rage always, but if they're getting under your skin, and we all know, we can watch kids. Kids know how to do this too, how to push buttons on a younger sister, brother, and make them scream and cry and do those things. But that is manipulating relationships, and it's not healthy.
No, it's not. There's something interesting. So I have started doing this for myself, and I've told a couple of clients about this. Like, if I find myself feeling out of control, right? Whether it's anger, like if I feel myself having a reaction to something that you said, like you say something to me and I get upset, right? That's not a you problem.
Right.
That's a me problem.
Great point.
So why am I getting upset about that, right? So because for the most part, as we go through our lives, people aren't trying to piss you off. That's not their goal. I mean, sometimes it might be their goal, but typically they're not. They're just trying to get through just like you are.
Right.
And they had no clue that what they just said was going to create that reaction from you.
Because they don't know what the files are in your past that are going to trigger your response.
They have no idea. So this is funny. So I actually told a client this, and I had to tell him like this. So what I do now is if I find myself uncomfortable with the way that I'm feeling because of something that someone else said, the first thing that I do is I stop. And in my head, not out loud, I thank them. Because they are bringing something to my attention that I need to deal with. They're not bringing something to my attention that they need to do differently.
So you're listening at that point so that you can respond, not react.
Exactly. So just that act of stopping and saying, oh, like, wait a second, that doesn't feel right. Thank you.
Right.
Because that's showing me something about me that needs to be different, whatever that looks like, right? It could just depend on the situation. So I did, so one client I told to do that, he said, I did make the mistake the first time of actually saying it out loud. She ticked me off and I said, thank you. And she's like, what?
One thing that I have experimented because of just years ago dealing with customers and being in the customer service industry all my life, When people become angry, and I know there's probably some argument to this, but typically when people become agitated and angry and they're getting aggressive towards you, they don't breathe. And the human body, I'm not a physician, but typically what I understand is we can only go 2 minutes without breathing, and either we're going to pass out or we're going to stop to catch a deep breath. And at that point, we're going to have an adrenaline dump. And I vividly remember, this has been so many years ago, and I've used this since, and only one time was I able to go. The client came into my place of business and was upset about something. I don't remember it. I just remember the client being upset, and they were a little bit difficult and always picking at things and, trying to negotiate the bill down and be angry to manipulate me. And I had a clock on the wall. And as he came in and started, I was watching that second hand, and he made it to almost 2 minutes. I did not interrupt. It was the hardest thing for me because, as I had already shared, I was such a reactionary person to defend myself. And when he was completely finished, I just said, is there anything else we screwed up yet that we need to address? And I mean, you could just see his shoulders, his whole body language, everything just dropped. And he was really calmly responds, and he says, nope, I think that's it. At that point, I nearly folded over laughing because it was the funniest thing I had witnessed because he was so aggressive. He'd done this before, but this time I didn't interrupt. Before I was now prepared to respond and not react. Before I would react, try to cut him off to explain to him where he's wrong or what our point of view was. I'm not saying it always works. I've had people tell me, they can go a lot longer and they can breathe while they're losing control, but you'll see a child even throw a fit. They can only throw a fit for so long. If you let the child throw that fit and you can keep, mom or dad off of them, at some point there's an adrenaline dump. And then you've got something different to deal with. But if they can catch their breath, they can just keep that adrenaline right up there and going, because you'll see athletes do it, whatever. And then when they're done what they're doing, I mean, they'll collapse.
Right, it's crash.
But it's that adrenaline can only hold for a certain length, and it takes oxygen to keep your mind and your body to function. And so it was just, to me, it was very interesting. I challenge anybody listening to this, if you're dealing with people in customer service, don't interrupt. Listen to understand, because once they believe that you understand and care, you're going to get a much different response and result in problem solving than you will if you're in that defensive mode all the time.
So a couple of things that kind of piggyback on that is I always encourage people when I start something new with them, right? So if we're working with a new client or we're teaching a program or taking them through a system or whatever it is, or even if I get up and to speak in front of a group, I challenge them to think about approaching it like an explorer as opposed to a researcher.
Okay.
And because the difference between the two is if you're listening for insight, you're an explorer, right? You're open to the possibilities, right? So you're thinking big picture, like, I don't know what's coming up, but I'm excited for what's coming up because it's going to be new and it's going to be a different way to look at it. If you're a researcher, you're listening for arguments. You're trying to prove something right or wrong based on your experience with it or your perception. So there's a huge difference when it comes to it to react and respond. It's that exploration versus research, listening for insights, not arguments.
Right.
And then, but the one thing that's kind of funny, you brought up the breath thing, is I encourage people all the time to stop and pay attention to how they're breathing.
Yes.
Because how you're breathing is a big tell. Am I reacting? Like a lot of times, you can tell when somebody's about to react because right before they start to talk,
yes,
the breath that they take is deep.
Because they know they're going in strong.
They're coming in. Yeah, if they're coming in hot, you can be prepared for them coming in hot because you see them take that deep breath and you
Right.
know. Now, on the other hand, if you see somebody take that deep breath and then they're quiet, they're getting ready to respond
Right.
because they're calming themselves down. They're preparing to be calm. They're not preparing to scream. So that deep breath can tell you two things based on
Right.
what happens next. Is that person reacting or is that person responding?
But even for ourselves, when you talk
Right.
about monitoring our breath, the one thing I always do is my breathing getting shallow. Because
Mhm.
now I'm going to react
Yep.
if it's shallow. And so
It's so
I
funny.
do box breathing. As quick as I catch myself doing it, I go into that mode and I visualize it.
Wait a minute. What's box breathing?
Well, I visualize it and I practice this. So this is what I call it. I'm sure I got it from somebody else, but I will practice this in other times because I can't always close my eyes, but I close my eyes and I go 1 across, 2 down, 3 over, 4 up. I do that visually in my mind as I'm taking a breath in. And then I do 1, 2, 3, 4 as I take a breath out. But it creates it's hard to do unless you practice to take that long of a breath.
Yeah. I'm
But as
sure there's
quick as-
people that don't know what box breathing is.
Right.
That's why I wanted
But
you to explain it.
That's
right?
what I'm doing. But
Yeah.
I can visually, I've done it enough with my eyes closed that now even when I'm in a situation that I know my adrenaline's rising, I can bring all of that down just with that breathing exercise. And it allows me to respond in place of react, because when our breath gets shallow, our dopamine changes in our body and all of these, it's crazy. Cortisol levels change. Everything in our physiology starts to change. And if we can get our breath back and get the oxygen levels up in our body, this is going to be a total different response.
We're really built for that. That's
Yes.
like if we pay attention to basically any emotion that you're feeling, if you pay attention to how you're breathing, you'll notice that it's different.
Right.
So there's a reason for that. It's like, so pay attention to it. If you don't like feeling a certain way, pay attention to how you're breathing. You can
Right.
change how you're feeling by changing how you're breathing.
Completely.
And it's just that simple, because that goes back to, the react versus respond. And we've talked about it before, as your life is coming
Right.
from you, not at you. It's so you have the ability to control how you're going to respond. Is your response going to come from your past as a reaction?
Right.
Or is it going to be there because you were intentional about building a new file for that situation and putting that in your file drawer?
And the interesting thing is, like, just the breathing went into my new file drawer. But the thing is, it's universal across different situations. I started a new hobby recently and my son's involved with it. And the first time I was getting ready to do this publicly, he kept coming up to me going, "Aren't you nervous? Aren't you nervous?" Like, I'm shaking. And finally I'm like, "Don't come back to me again. Wait till this is over." And I said, "No, I'm not nervous." But I was doing the breathing exercise and I frankly was calm. It wasn't, and he's like, and I said, "I did my box breathing." He's like, "What's that?" I'm like, "You should try it."
You should try it, yeah.
It'd calm you down in a lot of aspects in life. But
Yeah.
it's just, it's crazy. And I'm, again, not a physician. I'm sure we could have a physician that could go through all the physiology of that. But with that, any final thoughts that you want to share?
Not only that, I'm 57 years old and I did not know what box breathing was until I was 55. So
Okay.
if you're less than 55, you just learned something today that took me 55 years to understand. So take that for what it's worth, but pay attention to these little things that are talked about on these podcasts, because it's the little things that make a big difference. So
If
that's
you're
the last
if you're
thing.
a person that has trouble controlling emotions, you can Google a lot of information. I mean, I hope this conversation, even with the breathing, triggers somebody
Right.
where they can help control themselves. It's been in the last 5 years that I learned about it. So
The other thing, before we finish is whatever you do not say thank you out loud.
That's an internal check to slow yourself down and give yourself time to think and process.
If you do say that out loud, you're going to get a reaction.
Yes, and it may not be the one you want. You probably accentuate the problem. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Mindset Growth Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. These are just a lot of the things that we have learned that have changed the course of our life and how we had to change our mindset to get a different result. See you next time.